Hello Spark fans and welcome back to Advancing Spark, where we have another monthly roundup of everything that we're going to see in the Databricks platform throughout July. And I can't believe it's August, but this year is all of the crazy, but it's what it is. So we are going to see a few little things. There's some UI touch-ups, there's things like being able to arrange your widgets, which is tiny and a really small thing that should have been in years ago, but we can now do that, which is kind of cool. And we've got a new runtime, 8.4. We did cover that last time though, because it was just in beta and I was really late doing a roundup. So there's a few things we'll have a look and we'll step through. As always, do not forget to like and subscribe if you're new around here, or even if you're not and you haven't done it yet. And always let me know down in the comments what you think. Anything in here that you've been waiting for? Anything that you're like, ooh, I've got a use case for that. Let us know what your use cases are. It's always interesting to see. Let's go have a look. All right, so we've got our usual page. So this is the Azure Databricks release notes. We've got various different things that have come in throughout the month of July. I'm going to dive right to the bottom and then we'll scroll up and we'll go chronologically and see what we've got. So I did cover through this last time, as we said. You've got runtime 8.4. There is some new stuff in there. There's some stuff that snuck into the beta since I last ran through it. We'll take a very quick look later, but we'll crack on with the other stuff first. So first things actually first, the Repos API is now here. So if you've been having a play around with Databricks, you've got this whole thing now over on the side. We've got repos, which is kind of cool, and that allows us to sync up. I haven't got any syncs. That allows us to sync up various different repositories, source code repositories. So we can say, I want to have my GitHub repo, and it just really simplifies how we think about doing source control and how we think about doing development in Databricks. Because it used to be that whole idea that we just have our workspace, and then if you wanted to have feature branches, you'd have to have multiple copies of your notebook and then sync the one back in and deploy it, and it's just a whole bag of spanners, honestly. Now we've got repos, and you can attach a repo to a particular branch. So in my area, I can say I'm synced onto that branch, someone else can be working on a different branch. They'll have their own copy of all of the notebooks and files and all the other stuff in their particular things. It's just a feature branch of the repo. And they'll be able to see the notebooks that are in there and go and work on it. So you can have one person working on one version of a notebook, another person doing other development on the same notebook object, but in a different branch. So repos, super useful for working as actual developers on things like notebooks. Really good. However, people have been having some issues going, well, I forgot to hit pull. I forgot to refresh my copy. And it works kind of the same as if you're doing some local development and you forgot to actually do a fetch. You forgot to pull down any changes that have been made on the origin for the branch that you're working on, and then you just miss changes and you get sync errors, and it's a whole bag of pain. So one of the things that they've put in recently is this Repos API. So we can now actually programmatically say, this repo should now be on this branch. So we can actually tell it to switch branches, which could be kind of useful. Because there is one thing that really pains me currently in the repos bit, where if I'm working on my feature branch and I commit my changes, I push it off, and then I switch to my DevOps provider and I do a pull request. So I take those changes, I merge it into my primary code line, and then I delete that feature branch. Basically, I work like most developers ever. And then if I switch back to Databricks Repos, that'll still think it's on its feature branch, even though that feature branch no longer exists. I need to go and manually change it to a different branch and play it around. And that's fairly annoying. I mean, it's, first world problems. It's not a huge amount of pain there, but it's still something I have to remember to do. And then every time I have to do it, it's like, annoying. So this can help us with that kind of stuff. So what we can do is we can programmatically switch a branch. So this repo, so when you're on a given repo, when you have kind of the URL for it, that includes a repo ID. So we can poke the API at the particular repo ID that we're trying to work with, and we say, you're now on my main branch, on my dev branch, on my not feature branch. So we can get things to switch around automatically, and we can automatically add tags if we want to kind of be managing that on there as well. So it's super simple. There's not a lot in there, but essentially we can say, this repo should be on this branch, and it will automatically do a pull to get it in sync with the branch that we're pointing at. So we can kind of use it in two different ways. So we can either say, one, stick on the branch that you're currently on, just do a pull so I don't have to remember to do it. Or two, switch the repo, this repo should no longer be on this branch, it should be on that branch, and do a sync. So you can kind of just full push changes out and get it automatically ready for people to work. So this kind of, they've got the example in here of saying, if you're using GitHub, why not use GitHub Actions? And then when someone actually does a pull request into a particular thing, and like the essentially triggers some kind of DevOps pipeline, that pipeline can force a update of relevant repos. Super useful, real simple. That is the entirety of the API currently. It's call it, change branch, or give it a tag. That's it. But real nice little hooks into a better DevOps workflow. So, little innocuous little change, our little Repos API coming out, but some neat stuff that we can do that should, again, help that developer experience. Other bits, if you are still back on Databricks Runtime 5.5, it did have LTS, that's a long-term support, and they've now released an extended support. Now, there are some notes there. It goes into details about what the implications are. It's a slightly different version of Ubuntu. Be a little bit careful. You do need to make sure it actually works. But if you're currently running on the old 5.5 LTS cluster, go have a look at that and make sure you are at least up to date if you're not going to change into a more modern runtime. I know a lot of people can't because of library dependencies, but generally you want to be trying to stay more modern than 5.5 if you can help it. Okay, other bits and pieces, they've changed the compute page. So when you went and specified your clusters, you used to have links to all different bits of the Spark UI logs, that kind of stuff. They've taken it away from the cluster overview. You now have to get to that by going into a cluster and then looking at those relevant tabs. I never used it from the straight compute page. I don't know anyone who did. So that's fine. It's not a big shock, but they're just letting us know. Delta Live tables. So they've changed the UI so you can sort by the name. Cool. Again, all helps. Now the change costs. So in terms of the Delta Live tables, it automatically picked a cluster for you. In the video we did last time, kind of showed you that you can actually specify your own cluster config. But it's a little bit tricky, isn't it? If you say nothing, it automatically picked a certain cluster for you and picked how big it should be. And it's always like, really? Why are you deciding it should? No. So they have made it into a slightly cheaper default instance, and they've made sure it's got auto scaling on it. It'll go from between 1 and 5. So they have made that a little bit nicer than the default cluster, which is a bit chunkier. Still, absolutely 100% recommend overriding that and choosing the type of cluster it should run on. Just please do, rather than going, yeah, sure, defaults, whatevs. Okay, so Databricks jobs, again, last time, I think it was the last video we did last week, you've now got this multi-step process for using Databricks jobs. So you can say run this and then run these two in parallel, and then if that finishes, then run that next one, and you can do that kind of workflow orchestration in a DAG. And that is now there, and again, you need to enable it. You have to tick on, and then you can't disable it, but that's now in preview, and that should now be rolled out everywhere. So if you couldn't see it last time when we went through the video, you should be able to see it now. So go and have a look at that. It is quite useful. Spark SQL is now usable within the Delta Live Tables Python API. So you could always do entirely in SQL using create tables and just pure SQL syntax, or you could use PySpark and say saying, well, data frame is this, data frame is that. You couldn't do this mix and match. I couldn't say my data frame is equal to spark.sql and then just throw a bit of SQL at it. There was limited support for the full range of data frames in the Delta Live Tables API. You now can. Also, I guess as part of that, so when we're saying that little snippet of SQL that are pushing into it, it can also understand pointing at other Delta Live Table objects. So I can say spark.table and point at a Delta Live Table. Even if I haven't published it, it can be part of that internal data set as part of the orchestration workflow. Now, I think the next video I'm going to do will be the SQL side of Delta Live Tables, having a look at that, and we'll bundle that into it. So we'll have a look at Python with bits of SQL kind of injected into it, and we'll have a look at doing it purely in SQL to give you both sides of that coin. So interesting stuff there. Definitely the more flexibility that we have in things, the better. So making it able to understand all the normal spark.sql, spark.table is fantastic, but we'll have a look at the implications and how that actually works in another video. Okay. Databricks Runtime has gone GA for 8.4. Again, we'll dive into the details. We'll have a look at that at the end of this. There's only one or two things I want to point out just to hammer home from the last video that we did anyway. Okay, there's now some pipeline settings that we can do directly within Delta Live Tables that made it slightly easier to get at some of that config, which again is great. You don't have to create it and then go back and edit JSON and things. There's still editing JSON you have to do, but they've improved the UI slightly, which if you're not on the preview yet, if you haven't requested a preview from Databricks, you won't see that yet. So that'll mean nothing to you. Cool. All right, some usability things. So there was, normal UI stuff. If you have a pop-up window, you want to hit escape and just have it disappear. And there's just a few windows in the Databricks workspace that didn't work for. And I guess we all kind of got used to it going, yeah, no, well, that doesn't work in Databricks. You can't do that. Again, they're just making it slightly easier. They've fixed that bug. If you've ever got a pop-up now, you should be able to hit escape and that'll get fixed. Not that exciting, but it's kind of the baseline of what you expect in a UI, so great. Cool. Widgets. Now, widgets are a fun little thing. So when we're talking widgets, we're talking about the way that we inject parameters into a notebook. So I've got a notebook here. You can see I've got my 2 widgets I can play with, and I've just created them. So they are created in code. So we can see I've got 2 little bits of code. I want to have one widget, which is a text box. I'm going to call it file location, and this is the default value, and this is the label I give to my users. And I've got another one, which is a drop down. This again defaults, and these are the values. So I've got a pick list, normal stuff. But that was kind of limited in that's it. I had to. So the order they appeared was the order I actually created them in code, and they were all the same size. There was no adjustment to it. So now we've got this cheeky little button, which disappears if I zoom in too much. But you got this thing over here that lets us essentially puts it into edit mode. And it's not that crazy. We can change the size of stuff and we can click and drag stuff. So we can say, well, actually I want it that way around, I want it that way around. And we can have a bit of a play and say, well, actually that should be smaller because it's a tiny thing. Tick it done, and that's done. So real simple, nothing particularly crazy there, but just a little bit of when you're using widgets, making it that tiny bit more user-friendly. Now, honestly, the majority of the ways I've seen a lot of people use widgets, especially on the data engineering side, is for automated parameter inputs anyway. So it's not a person clicking those buttons, it's another system passing metadata in so that we can run 1,000 jobs, 100 jobs, whatever we happen to be doing. So it's not going to hit a huge number of pure data engineering jobs. But when you're building some little tools and little notebooks and data exploration things for your analysts, it just goes a long way to just make that navigation slightly nicer. So we can do that. We can play around with the sizes. We've still got what we used to have. So we can choose to say, when I change my widgets, should it run the command that was actually accessing the widget value? Should it run the entire notebook every time I change it? Which, please don't do that, because anytime you edit any of them, it'll run the whole thing. It's kind of madness. Or just do nothing. So you can change the values, but you have to hit go before it'll do anything. You can have a play around with that however you want it. And do you want it pinned to the top? So do you want it to, remember, I can kind of pin it. It'll go away, I have to scroll to the top to see it. Should it remember it? Like that. And then quite quickly, if we remove them, so if we get rid of the widgets, and then I bring them back, it actually remembers the settings. So that file type, it was the second one that I created, but it's actually the first one up because that's the last layout that I created. So I think kind of in here, we've got that reset layout. If you change the layout at all, there's a little bit of metadata held next to the notebook itself, which will then just remember it. So even if you then don't use that widget, if you then create a widget again with the settings, it'll still have the layout unless you click reset layout, in which case it forgets it and goes back to defaults. So be a little bit aware of that. Be a bit funky if you're changing and swapping and adding and removing widgets a lot, but it's just quite a nice little feature. Okay, cool. I mean, this next one does kind of just, it warms my cold, dead SQL-y heart, because that's where I started. I wrote a lot of SQL getting started in the data and analytics world. And now if you're using autocomplete, you start typing in select and you hit tab, it's going to go, oh, they're writing SQL, and it's going to automatically uppercase your SQL keywords. It just makes me happy. Again, it's just leaning slightly more into making it a better SQL development environment, slightly more kind of just useful and native for people writing SQL. Now, SQL is entirely case sensitive inside Databricks, so it doesn't matter if you uppercase or lowercase them. Pure formatting aesthetics, and it's just nice. It says, yeah, it doesn't affect the query. It's case insensitive, but it's nice to see and it's easier to read. Another quite quick, simple one. So we've got the ability to bulk export. So we've always had that in terms of I can take all my demonstrations, I can take all my streaming demos, and I can do an export into DBC. That's like kind of the Databricks library of notebooks. I forgot what the C stands for. Or we can do it as HTML. But now we've got the ability to do source file. So we could take one notebook and export it as a .py, .scala, .sql, whatever it happened to be. But we couldn't say take that entire folder and export it in their native formats. In order to do that, we had to use the CLI, the command line interface, and say, you know, Databricks workspace, export dir, tell it where to do it, locally, and then it spit things out for us. And before we had repos, that's how I did a lot of source control, by forcing it to do that, because I need it in its .py native format. Now this just makes it slightly easier. If I want to take a particular folder and export it in its source file, I can say source file. I'll spit out a zip file down at the bottom, and I get something like this. So I get a zip file, you look inside there, and you can see it's done it as my .py. It's got my folder structure in there, and you can see I've got the relevant thing, whether it's SQL or py. So super easy, super simple, really nice little change, quite useful to see. Okay, we've got another thing. So we can display up to 10,000 records in a results set. Now, it used to be limited to 1,000. So if you're trying to do a fairly chunky query, just so you could hit that download button and then actually get it locally and have a play with it, you couldn't do it more than 1,000. You had to then tell Spark to write it to a CSV, probably actually force it to write it to a single node. And so you're doing repartition as part of it, or coalesce. And it's just a few steps to try and get out that data. So now they've upped it. So if you bring back something that has a ton of rows, well, up to 10,000, you can run it and you can try and do it. Do I have that? I don't even have it in here. So if I wanted to have that more than 1,000, it'll say, actually, you've got more than 1,000. Do you want to rerun it with everything? Now, be warned, that is going to force all those records up to the driver. That means the driver is going to have more strain in it because you're going to get a memory impact. It's going to have things coming up there. But you can get up to 10,000 rows, hit download as a CSV, and then you've got that result set to play with. So quite useful, have a play around with it. Again, a nice little UI thing. There's changes to the feature store, so you can actually go and see the freshness of your features. So actually, was it recently updated by a scheduled job? Has this not been updated for months, and therefore probably not a good feature to be using? So you've now got that little bit of context if you're using Feature Store. I know we've not done a video on Feature Store yet, so we'll kind of dig into that detail at some point. Got Germany is a new region for Databricks. Now that is fantastic news for me. So as a consultant, we care a lot about dealing with data, and people care a lot about GDPR and data sovereignty. Now there are quite kind of strict rules in Germany about data's not allowed to leave the region. You cannot take data outside of Germany if it is sensitive, it's to do with PII, personally identifiable information. And so there's whole things about, actually, we can't use certain tools if we have to do it in Germany because it has to be in the Azure region, and it didn't have Databricks in there. So fantastic that we can now use Databricks in the Germany West Central region. Just gives us more flexibility, more ability to use that in pan-European rollouts using lots of data, which is great. Okay, Databricks Lite has extended support for one of the runtimes. If you're using the DBX Lite runtime for doing kind of small engineering jobs, that's where you don't have any of the UI, you don't have kind of notebooks, and you're just firing jobs at it and it's nice and cheap. Better localization of the user interface. So for quite some time, if you're using the Databricks interface and you want a language other than English, you're kind of stuck. And they've improved the localization, so you can go and have a play around and get the whole UI in the language that you want. So we've just had the release of the French and Portuguese versions, which is very useful. And finally, we can now actually sort of manage the permissions of MLflow. So MLflow that's our experiment tracker. So if we're building a machine learning model, and we're kind of running it several times and improving the parameters and training and retraining a model, it's becoming more and more of trying to attack that enterprise data science grade. And in order to do that kind of thing, we need this kind of better security model. So being able to say who has permissions to different experiments, who's allowed to retrain, who's allowed to do that, being able to amend those via a REST API means we can hook it into automated security provisioning and just have it more baked in to the rest of our enterprise security model. So again, great. That is just getting more features, getting extended, doing more stuff. So how are we doing for time? Oh, okay. I said it'd be a quick one. I lied. Final things, just to poke at the Databricks Runtime 8.4. Again, we saw the beta, and there's lots of things in there. A few things I just want to kind of quickly repeat to make sure people are aware. Number one, first cut of Delta sharing we are seeing in there. So you can actually use Delta sharing directly in 8.4. So if you are sharing something from one of your Databricks workspaces and you want to pick it up in another Databricks workspace, you can now actually use that straight command without having to download the library, connect it to your cluster, and provision all that stuff. So it's just taking steps towards Delta sharing being more generally baked into the experience. A few things about performance and Delta general improvements. Optimize, which always just assumed that you wanted a 1 gig file size, and you could override it with some settings. They've tweaked that slightly. So if your Delta table is under 2.56 terabytes, then it'll actually aim for 256 meg. And then all the way up to 10 gig at the 10 terabytes. At the 10 terabytes point, it'll then be back to its 1 gig default. And then in between it, a bit of a continuum. And it'll decide the right file size depending on the overall size of your Delta table. So just some general improvements that they've made throughout there. Again, we have gone through a lot of this stuff. We've definitely gone through backfilling with autoloader, all that kind of stuff. I think that's the main things I wanted to poke at. Yeah. So those Delta sharing and the improved optimize, definitely worth being aware that they are in 8.4. And yeah, I mean, given it's almost that time of the month, I'll be expecting to see another Databricks Runtime beta coming up soon, and I'm sure we'll do a cover of that. Oh, okay, yes, I know that was tons and tons of stuff, and a lot of them are little quality of life improvements. That button's now a bit better. You can now actually arrange things how you want. You can close a window rather than have to click on the X. All that kind of stuff just makes the platform there a little bit smoother, a little bit more accessible, a little bit easier to work with. So all good to see. Nothing in terms of you can now do something you've never been able to do before, but lots of quality of life and quality of engineering and quality of automation that we're seeing going in. So all really good stuff. That is all for today. I've managed to run through that giant list of doom. As always, let me know what you think. Let me know if there's anything in that list where you're like, oh, that's really cool. I've been waiting for that. Let me know if you're looking at it going, oh, there's something I was waiting for, but it's not in there. Where is it? Again, all feedback, let us know down in the comments. As always, do not forget to like and subscribe. And I'll be back with a video on Delta live tables talking about SQL very, very soon. So I'll catch you then. Cheers.